Hey guys, welcome back, and today we'll be talking about the Analects of Confucius 3.14, which is basically talking about why did Confucius think that the Zhou Dynasty was so great? Why did he think that it was the golden age of China at that time? But right now, we don't really hear about the Zhou Dynasty because it is the third dynasty out of all of China's history. And right now, we know of China's golden age as the Tang Dynasty. So here we get to see why Confucius thinks that the Zhou Dynasty, or the earlier Zhou Dynasty, I should say, was so great. And yeah, without further ado, let's get started. The master said, Zhou took stock of the two previous dynasties. Splendid is her culture. I followed the Zhou. So, we'll just break this down sentence by sentence like we did a long time ago. But it's just because, although it may seem simple, there's actually a lot of information packed in here. Alright, so Confucius says, Zhou took stock of the two previous dynasties. The two previous dynasties being the Shang and the Xia. So the Xia is the first and the Shang is the second. And he's saying here that the Zhou took stock, and the stock in Chinese, the word for this interestingly translated word is jian, and that just means not really passively copying or anything, but actually actively reflecting upon it. It being the mistakes that the two previous dynasties had made, and what good things they contributed or added to the society. So what Confucius is saying here is that the Zhou, and the reason why it was so great, the first reason anyway, is because it didn't really become another copy of the Shang dynasty or the Xia dynasty. And it didn't really, come up with an abstract kind of idea of how the dynasty should work, and then going from there, blank slate, new thing, no building on top of previous history, which is what we kind of saw in the West, I might say, with communism, where you just thought of a really efficient idea, or an efficient idea in your mind, that is, and when you actually put it into action, you'll see how some things might not have been what you expected it would be. And so what Confucius is saying is that the Zhou dynasty instead learned from the mistakes that the two previous dynasties made. So the Zhou dynasty made sure to learn from these mistakes and to be careful not to repeat those mistakes again. And so they took out the bad things and put in the good things that the two previous dynasties had. And so this dynasty now is kind of like the product of all of the good things that the Shang and the Xia had. And I also might add that Confucius isn't really appreciating all of the Zhou dynasty, but instead he's appreciating the earlier part of the dynasty, because later, which is the period in which he was living in the Eastern Zhou dynasty, and that was when the dynasty was really, crumbling apart, and all of that good stuff is kind of gone. So what Confucius is saying is that he just wants the Zhou dynasty to remember how good it was back then, and, incorporate it back when they needed it the most. And Confucius is also saying that progress isn't really just, copying. It's a continuous learning journey. And no matter how long it might take, but yeah, it's very continuous and it grows with experience. You can't just put a thought into there without any, experience and expect it to turn out really good. And also another thing is, I realized I mentioned how Confucius wanted to go back to when it was really good, but he doesn't actually want to turn back time. But I don't want to go out of order. I don't want to skip around. That's the last sentence, actually. I follow the Zhou, but I'll get to that later. But here we're moving on to the second sentence. Splendid is her culture. And I want to elaborate more on the culture part. And culture, or wen, could be translated as culture, which it is translated here, but that's kind of too narrow almost. And a better way to translate it might be it's actually the whole entire map of civilized human order, which could be the rituals and the ceremonies, which are the code of conduct that control almost everything you do, but it's not really control because you're doing it out of your own benefit, I guess. And there's music and art, which is just a thing that brings people together, kind of, and something to be appreciated. And then there's the social kind of hierarchy almost, but it's not kind of like a caste system. It's not, an actual social hierarchy. It's just the respect part. Like we've talked about before, elder and younger must respect the elder, and the children must respect the parents. And there's also the kind of the ethical norms, which are things like humaneness or dutifulness or trustworthiness or anything like that. And there's also just language and writing. And all of these that were just listed, Confucius argues that that's what makes the Zhou Dynasty so beautiful, so complete, so sophisticated. And all of these things were just mixed together into a big soup of harmonious society. And now we'll talk about the last sentence. I follow the Zhou. So by saying that he is following the Zhou Dynasty, that doesn't mean that he wants to reverse time. Instead, unlike the kind of the Taoist philosophers at his time also, who actually did want to return to the kind of the primitive or original way of nature or being that doesn't include wen, Confucius actually really doesn't like that idea. He thinks that being a part of, the culture is a part of enjoying humanity. So a raw, uncarved wood, which is what Taoists really like to refer to as a metaphor for, potential. Although that might have potential, it's the carving and polishing, which is wen. That's what makes the wood into a beautiful and useful vessel. So what Confucius is saying is that to follow Zhou is to affirm life itself. But of course, it doesn't mean that you have to follow everything that the Zhou did rigidly. Instead, it means embracing the Zhou method, which is looking at earlier mistakes and applying that creatively to anything. And it could even apply to you in your own life. Of course, this is 2,500 years in the past, but it actually does relate to us. It relates to you, and it relates to me, and it relates to everyone. And it's the process of looking at history or taking in all this information, all these opinions, all these views of things, and then you start to, process all of these down and pick which ones you like and which ones you would like to adopt. And that's you. You're the uncarved wood, and by going through this learning process, this kind of learning from others' mistakes and also adjusting things accordingly, then you can have you're kind of your, but I don't want to say that you're a vessel because, like we've talked about before, the gentleman is not a vessel. You're not designed for only one thing. You can be for a lot of things. And yeah, that will be all today. And if you have any questions, please feel free to ask me, and I'll try my best to answer you. And yeah, without further ado, let's get started. Yeah, okay. I'll see you in the next one. Bye.